Luke 21 deals a lot with the same material that we find in Matthew 24, as well as over in Mark. We find a similar passage there. At the time when Jesus is at the temple with his disciples. Of course, he was there frequently. But just want to look at some things today. It deals with signs of events that was to come and is to come. And I think it's something that in the day that we live is timely, because a lot of folks you hear commented frequently of, we surely are in the end times. And I don't question that. But I think we need to keep in mind how that the Lord expects us to approach this time and the events and so forth, and actually how that we might even deal with them. I'm going to just read a passage here beginning at the 25th verse of this chapter. There shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Now that is the 25th through the 28th verses of the 21st chapter of the Gospel of Luke. As I said, this chapter, for the most part, the first 4 verses deals with the widow's mite. Totally separate line of thought there. But in the 5th verse, it brings up how that at the temple, it says, some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts. And he said, as for these things which ye behold, the days will come, in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And there's always the question here as you go through this chapter, and I'm not going to go verse by verse or anything, but as you go through this chapter, is the Lord talking about something that was shortly to come to pass, which he begins with a statement here which definitely has a reference to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, because that exactly is what happened. When the Romans encircled the city, and he speaks here of when you see the city of Jerusalem, when you see it besieged, that's time to head for the hills, in other words, to flee from the city. And as far as history, what history gives us is that when the Romans did come, because there were rebellions, and there were not just that one alone, but this was the major rebellion of the Jews against the Romans. And the followers of Christ, his church was in Jerusalem there, because Jesus had forewarned them. As they saw these things approaching, history tells us they fled across Jordan to a town called Pella. When that Jerusalem fell, those occupants were strictly what we would call Jews or followers of the Jewish religion. The followers of Christ had fled. He knows how to take care of his people. That much I think we can all understand. But anyway, the stones, because the temple, what they were admiring here, the temple, which originally when they came back from the exile from Babylon, they rebuilt the temple. And it was, a significant structure. The older ones that remembered the old temple of Solomon, the aged ones, they wept because they remembered the glory of the former temple. But the younger ones that had perhaps even been born and raised in exile, their desire was to see a temple, and they rejoiced. But it was not the temple of Solomon. But later on we find that as time progressed, coming to the New Testament era, Herod the Great had enlarged on this temple. He wanted to keep the people happy. And he made a beautiful structure there as he enlarged upon that original temple. It had plates of gold. It had marble that was so pure white that it glistened in the sun. And from a distance, it was just a radiant, glorious structure. And the disciples here, as they looked at these gold plates that were embedded in the walls and all that was around the structure, they were admiring it, of how beautiful it was. And sometimes people get to admiring things for its beauty, and it draws them away from God. Not intentionally. But we find that if you just take the New Testament, the Gospels in general, the Jews, as they viewed that temple, to them, that was something that was literally just worshipped. And we know how that goes. We've heard people speak of their church buildings, their structure. And now it's not just a building, it's a facility, it's a campus with many buildings. People talk and brag about those things. What are they doing? In a sense, they are worshiping those things. It draws us away from the focus we should have on the honor and worship of God. Well, these disciples, that's pretty much what they were doing. And Jesus, he simply tells them, to begin with, he says the time's going to come when one stone will not be left upon another. And according, again, I'm referring a lot to history here this morning, but that's just, it fits. What I understand from history, when the Romans finally, that they entered into Jerusalem, and they were fighting and battling with the people there, the last stronghold was the temple. That's where the people went. It was the most secure, strongest building in the city. And the Romans took it as well. And somewhere along the line, somebody set fire in that temple. And the fire raged to such a degree that the gold plates, it is said, melted and went into the crevices of the stone of the structure. And the general at that time, he ordered his soldiers to tear apart or to pull apart those stones to get access to all that gold. And that's exactly what they did. Well, what happened in that process? One stone was not left upon another. It was torn apart so they could get to that gold. Exactly what Jesus said, as one stone will not stand upon another. Now, there's perhaps more to it than just that, but that's where he began with his disciples. And it brought to them this question, Lord, when's this going to happen? Lord, what's all this going to amount to? How's it going to come to pass? What is the sign that we can determine these things when it's about to happen? And he begins to speak to them there. And in the 8th verse he says, take heed that ye be not deceived. That's the first thing that he says. Doesn't go into what we would say signs like this is going to happen or that's going to rise up or all these things. He says, be careful, be aware, pay attention that you're not deceived, that you're not led astray. Why? Because he said that many false Christs will rise up. Many will come in my name that is claiming to be the Christ. Again, historically, that exactly is what happened. That there were others, and there had been others even previous to Jesus, who had claimed to be the Messiah, or had at least took upon them the general idea that presented to the people that they were the Messiah. They may have not said, "I am Messiah," but the people thought they were, because of how eloquent they were, of how that they had this charisma about them that attracted people, and they got a following. And they fought the Romans, or they tried to overthrow this or that. This happened historically. Jesus said, be aware of these things. We still need to be aware. Not that the church building would be torn down. Not that any structure anywhere would be destroyed. But we need to be aware lest we be led astray. Because, yes, there may not be someone that would rise up in our time and say, "I am Christ." But there are those that arise in the name of Christ and identify with Christ, that have doctrines and teachings that will lead a person astray from the truth of the gospel. We need to always be conscious of these things, aware of these things. And Jesus, to his disciples here, put this first. Put this the very first thing. Take heed. Take heed, lest you be deceived. You say, well, as a child of God, yes, a child of God can be deceived. We read, over in the epistles, even like in Sunday school where we're studying with the Colossians there. What was Paul dealing with? He was dealing with certain teachings and doctrines that was leading people in that church astray. We need to be aware. We need to take heed. For many, not just one or two or a few, but many, he says, shall come. He speaks there of things that's going to happen, of wars that's going to rise up, nation against nation. And we know how that's even carried down to today. There has always been wars, even previous to when Christ gave this here. He said of wars and nations fighting against nations, kingdom against kingdoms. There has been war since, history began as far as nations are concerned. But it's something that we need to keep in mind. It gets our attention. This is just part of it. This is part of the process. But he speaks here of how that of great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines and pestilences. That's in the 11th verse there. Natural disasters, epidemics. Do we not hear of epidemics in our time? Do we not hear of famines, of disastrous events, earthquakes? We have quite a few of those around here, it seems. Nothing major so far. But last week when Sheree and I were down in Yellowstone, we stood in this one spot. They got one of these plaques here. What you're looking over is the Yellowstone volcano. Well, what you see is mountains and trees and just a large valley. You think a volcano? But yeah, down underneath, they call Yellowstone a super volcano. And they say when that thing goes, why, it's going to take the western United States with it. I don't know. Someday it probably will. Someday things are going to turn around in there. But we know this, there's volcanoes even today that are erupting, it's making the news. We know that earthquakes, we know of all these things that happens. Natural disasters. And we think, is this, what did Jesus say? As he comes down here to a certain part, he said, but the end is not by and by. The end is not by and by. By and by simply means yet. The end is not yet. This isn't it, in other words. But they're going to happen. And they're always going to happen until the end. But he comes down and he speaks of how there'll be persecution and the persecutions that even the disciples there that they experienced, and how that they would be brought before authorities, and how that they would be persecuted even by their families, even to be put to death. Paints a very dark and bleak picture. He speaks there of how that Jerusalem will be encompassed. Now, for them in their day, this meant something to them. Something they experienced, something they saw, something that they observed. And some of these men, these followers, no doubt the words of Jesus was in their ears when they observed it. The Apostle Paul, he died in the 60s. He didn't see the fulfillment of this. Of course, he wasn't there at this time. But he understood that there were things to come. But we do find that John, whom they more or less, as far as setting dates, and we know setting dates, there's some matter of accuracy there. But as far as setting dates, died somewhere around AD 90, up in there. Last of the apostles, he heard the actual words of Jesus. And he witnessed, he was alive when these things came to pass on Jerusalem. Now you say, is that all there is? No. He's not talking just about Jerusalem. I believe the Lord is using what happened in Jerusalem, what happened in AD 70, as a miniature example of the state and the condition of the world at large when the Lord does come back again. In other words, here was this that is fulfilled, but there is still that which is going to be fulfilled in the world at large. And that brings us over to the 25th verse, where I begin reading, "And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, and the sea and the waves roaring." And what's he describing there? He's talking about signs, events, happenings in the heavens. How often? Maybe you don't pick up on things that I do, and maybe I pick up on things that, we notice things differently sometimes. But in the news, ever so often, you'll find these announcements. These scientists, they're looking at some asteroid that's coming close to the earth, and then they'll say it's so many million miles away. Well, that does cause concern, because someday one of those things might not be so far away. Matter of fact, over in Revelation, it speaks of a mountain on fire that crashes into the sea. Is that an asteroid? Could be. I'm just saying here he's talking about signs, about events, about things happening of wonders and amazement. The sun, the moon. We have the blue moons, it seems frequently anymore. We've had one occasion of how things were lined up in the heavens that hadn't happened in hundreds of years. Upon the earth, distress of nations. Are the nations today in distress? Sure they are. We have to admit they are in distress. There's suffering, there's trouble, there's anxiety, there's burdens that are upon people's minds and hearts. There's much distress amongst the nations. You hear it, one leader pushes a button and off go all these rockets, and there you go. It's just one of those, it's something that's very edgy in the news. What was going on 500 years ago? There was distress amongst the nations. There was wars and the continuation of wars. But does it not seem that today it is more so than it was, say, 500 or 1,000 years ago? Distress of nations. Not just militarily, but economically, and just in any level of society that you might want to think on. There is distress amongst the nations. And next he says, and perplexity. Perplexity has to do with confusion. Perplexity has to do with commotions. Perplexity has to do with not knowing which way to turn, to being overwhelmed with just what to plan, what to do, because you're so perplexed. Do we not live in perplexing times? More so than any other generation. The sea and the waves roaring. They used to call it tidal waves. Now they come up with this nice little word, tsunami, or something like that. Tsunami, some say. Tidal waves is a lot easier for me to pronounce, I know that. But every time there's an earthquake out in the ocean, well, here comes this tidal wave somewhere. And we know they're very destructive. It causes stress upon mankind. Men's hearts failing them for fear. Men's hearts failing them. I heard an old preacher, he used to preach about that was literally men having heart attacks. Well, I wouldn't argue with that. More heart attacks today than historically we know about. From just the fact of what's going on in the world. But when he's talking about men's hearts failing them, it's just that they're losing courage. They're becoming weak. They're fainting because of fear. People are panicky about such small, minute details of things. And what was this fear? He says, for looking after these things which are coming on the earth. What's going on in this world? Just go down, turn the news on, and you'll know. I'm not going to go down any list. It's too long. All the causes of concern and distress in the hearts and minds of people. People are panicky. People, they run out in the streets and riot over any type of subject, any type of topic. You'll get a riot going somewhere. Doesn't take much. And it says, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Think about that. The powers of heaven shall be shaken. I don't know to give you a detailed interpretation of this, but it implies to me a great magnitude. Something that's big going on. For the heaven to be shaken, the powers of heaven to be shaken. And then, Jesus comes down to his disciples back then. Now remember, he's talking to his disciples there in Jerusalem. They're at the temple. And then, they wanted signs. He's given them all these things that's going to happen. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Do we have a timeline? Kind of fuzzy. There's always been wars. There's always been earthquakes. There's always been famines. There's always been, everything he listed here, it's always been down through the course of time. So he's not given a definite calendar timeline. But I believe what he's telling us here is of how that they will increase and grow as far as in the numerical part of it, how many of this, and the intensity of it, and so forth. And then, when you say "and then," you're taking another step, aren't you? They shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. I know there's a lot of ideas and interpretations and teachings on the end times. And a lot of things troubles us. But as a child of God, as the Lord's church, how should we respond to this? I mean, while you read that chapter, I've just kind of covered through some of this this morning as far as all that it says here. It gets scary. It would terrify many people. And it does. And they become so overly concerned and focused on certain points. But what did Jesus tell them? 28th verse. And when these things begin to come to pass, when they begin to come to pass, not out in the middle of it, but at the very beginning, as you realize these things, this is part of the plan. This is part of the teaching here that Jesus was giving. And when you see these things begin to come to pass, then it calls for action. You realize this is coming to pass. Then what do you do? Well, there's two things here. Pretty much they're related, but two things. Then look up. If he's telling them to look up, that tells me that previous to that point, you were looking down. And if you get into the Greek of the scripture here, to look up means to unbend. In other words, you were bent over, now unbend. Rise and look up. Take heart. Stand tall. What he's telling them here. Don't cower in the corner somewhere. Stand tall. And lift up your heads. Again, two things. They're separate, but they're very much related here. Look up. Unbend yourself, straighten up, and lift up your head. Yeah. In Colossians, Paul says this in the 3rd chapter. If ye then be risen with Christ, what's he referring to there? He's writing to people that were alive, hadn't died yet. He's not talking about a physical resurrection, but if you be risen with Christ, in other words, we identify with his resurrection, and there's a spiritual resurrection that we are connected with him. Seek those things which are above. Lift up your heads. Seek those things which are above. Why? He says there, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Now someday he's not going to sit there any longer, is he? He's going to rise from that throne. And he's going to come back. And how are we going to see him? if our heads are hung down, if we're all bent over with shame and burdened down with the cares of life and scared and so forth of the things, the events that are going on about us. Stand up straight and look for the Lord. Set your affections on things above, not on things on the earth. Set your affections. If you set your affections on something, what are you doing? You're setting your heart. You're focusing your heart, your love, your attention, your desires upon that object. So Jesus says to his disciples to look up and lift up your heads. Why? Because your persecution is coming? Because famine is coming? Because war is coming? No. Stand up straight. Look to the heavens. For your redemption draweth nigh. Your redemption. That term redemption, it deals with being set loose, to be made free, to be delivered. When that day comes, it's not going to be a day of sorrow and grief for the children of God, those that are bought by the blood of Jesus Christ, ransomed from their sins by His blood. No, it's going to be a day we're going to be set loose from this old world, from the aches and the pains, the sorrows and the grief. We won't have to worry about war no more. I think there's a song about that, isn't there? But we won't. We're not going to worry about war no more. We're not going to worry about sickness no more, and the aches and the pains. Because our redemption draweth nigh. Well, we say now we are redeemed, and we are. We've been purchased by the blood of Jesus Christ. But what he's talking about here is the fullness of that. When we realize, come to the reality of that redemption. And as Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, we'll meet him in the sky, and there shall we ever be with the Lord. Where he is, we're going to be. That's something that we need to stand tall. Rightfully stand tall and lift our head up. Be strong, be brave, because our redemption draweth nigh. So as we see a variety of events and happenings in this world, we're concerned because it all points toward that time. What will we go through? What's the worst thing that can happen to us? We wouldn't want it, wouldn't desire it, but what's the worst thing that could happen to us?
You live through it.
You're there. You experience it. But afterwards, it's eternity with Jesus. I know the Bible speaks of 1,000 years and so forth, and I understand that. But, there's 1,000 years and there's eternity. Eternity has no measure. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that sweet? Doesn't that encourage you? It should. And I hope it does. Because I think that's what Jesus was trying to do with his disciples there. He's telling them all these things that's going to occur, that you're going to experience and go through yourself, and things that troubles the world. Stand tall, because your redemption draweth nigh. That's my message to you this morning.